They were the voices that scored entire eras. Women who turned raw hurt into multi-platinum plaques, who converted shattered hearts into Billboard #1s. But beneath the spotlight glare, beneath the sequined gowns, beneath the rehearsed smiles and media-trained interviews, there was another narrative the industry quietly tried to lock away for decades. A narrative built on unrecorded hotel room meetings and studio sessions that never appeared in the credits. Whispers about affairs that, according to people around them, strained marriages to breaking point, fractured lifelong friendships, and nearly derailed major tours. Some of R&B's most beloved legends didn't just shatter sales records, it was said they shattered each other's lives too. In this investigation, we pull back the velvet curtain on 10 female icons whose private relationships were said to be even more volatile than their biggest hits. For years, insiders claimed there was a diva who allegedly kept a rotating list of lovers on the road. A superstar whose jealous partner, according to crew members, once crashed a rehearsal in a fury, swinging accusations like weapons. There were stories about a Motown queen who was believed to have slept her way into power, only to watch that carefully built kingdom collapse around her. About a soul icon whose romantic life became so tangled that friends quietly begged her to slow down before something irreversible happened. But the rumors only scratched the surface. The shadows, some people said, were darker than anything the tabloids ever dared to print. And tonight, we open the file the industry hoped would stay sealed. The first name inside that file isn't just a legend. She is the template, the standard the business held up as untouchable perfection. And yet, behind the curtain, Whitney Houston lived a life so divided, so chaotic, so painfully human that even those closest to her later admitted they never fully knew who she really was. Picture this: Newark, New Jersey, 1979. A teenage Whitney steps out of a cramped rehearsal room in a neighborhood community center, the last notes of a gospel song still vibrating in the walls. Sweat beads along her hairline, breath slightly ragged. Just a step behind her is Robin Crawford. Not so close that anyone could call it a public display, not so far that anyone could pretend not to notice. Close enough that the whispers start. They were inseparable, one backup singer would later say. Where Whitney showed up, Robin was already leaning against a wall, waiting. It was a friendship that felt like a secret language. By 1983, when Whitney finally signs with Arista Records, the scene has changed. Flashbulbs explode. Executives raise glasses. Clive Davis stands beside her, smiling like a man who knows he's just found pure gold. But behind the champagne toasts, something else slides into place, something quieter, colder. Robin is still there, but now she stands a few steps back, just out of the frame. According to several former staffers, that's when the surveillance really began. It was said that Arista kept an eye on everything: Whitney's friendships, her late-night outings, even who she hugged a little too long backstage. The label wanted the perfect all-American superstar image. No gossip, no shadows, no questions. The shadows grew anyway. By 1992, Whitney is walking down the aisle with Bobby Brown. To the public, it looks like a fairy tale, pop royalty marrying R&B bad boy. But to insiders, it felt less like a wedding and more like someone lighting a fuse. And it didn't take long for that fuse to spark. People from the Bodyguard World Tour still talk about one rehearsal in Atlanta in the fall of 1993. Different witnesses remember different details, but the core never changes. Bobby storms into the room mid-run-through, his voice cutting through the music, demanding answers. "Who is he? Who you been calling?" he supposedly shouts. No one is quite sure which he Bobby meant. What everyone agrees on is the silence that followed. Around that same period, a studio engineer claimed Whitney was suddenly clocking extra hours behind a locked door with a producer she seemed unusually close to. Nothing was ever confirmed, nothing officially denied. It simply became part of the legend, folded into what insiders began calling her double life. Because in daylight, Whitney was the immaculate pop princess, every note perfect, every photo pristine. At night, it was said she slipped into guarded parties where cameras were banned, surrounded by fellow singers, dancers, and producers who whispered about her wild streak once the music got loud enough, One backup vocalist described a private after-show gathering in Los Angeles in 1994. Whitney walked in like a storm, the room freezing for half a second, everyone recalibrating around her presence. According to that vocalist, Whitney poured her own drinks, laughed too loudly, then settled onto a producer's lap as if daring anyone to mention it. At some point, they disappeared down a narrow hallway and didn't return for a while. When she came back, her lipstick, the witness claimed, wasn't as precise as it had been when she entered. The next morning, however, she was on stage again, flawless, professional, the night erased from her expression. The most explosive story that followed her for years came from the time before Bobby. It was rumored that Whitney had once been romantically involved with a prominent black producer who suddenly vanished from her inner circle after Clive Davis allegedly stepped in. Some people insisted he was paid to walk away. Others believed he simply chose to leave rather than become collateral damage. No one has ever produced proof, and the truth, if there is one, remains buried under layers of hearsay. What is known is this. Between 1992 and 1995, the marriage between Whitney and Bobby was dragged under by jealousy, resentment, and addictions that clashed instead of calming each other. Tabloids printed their own versions, but insiders quietly claimed the real story was even messier. A web of suspicions, arguments, and secrets, carefully shielded by powerful people who needed Whitney to stay on stage, no matter what was happening at home. Whitney Houston may have been the voice of a generation, a once-in-a-lifetime talent whose songs still echo across decades. But behind the microphone, her private world was treated like a battlefield, a place where loyalty, love, fear, and control collided. And in that war, almost no one, including Whitney herself, walked away completely unscarred. Before the world crowned her the Queen of Funk, before the Grammys, the sold-out arenas, and the icon status, Chaka Khan already carried a reputation inside the business as something far more volatile, a presence that could light up a room in seconds or burn it down just as fast. The year is 1974, Chicago. Backstage at the airy Crown Theater, the air is thick. Smoke curls through narrow hallways, and not all of it is from cigarettes. Members of Rufus drift in and out of dressing rooms, laughing too loudly, the sharp smell of tequila mixing with whatever white powder is quietly changing hands that night. In the center of the chaos sits Chaka 21, magnetic, unpredictable, radiating an energy that feels half miracle, half warning. A guitarist from the band would later say that when Chaka locked eyes with you, it was like the rest of the world vanished, and a single weekend in her orbit could rewrite your entire life. Rumors inside the camp claimed she was romantically involved with two different members of Rufus during their ascent, sometimes with timelines that overlapped more than anyone wanted to admit. One story that circulates among former crew centers on a night in 1976, Detroit. In the green room, voices suddenly escalate into a full-blown fight. According to a tour manager, two musicians ended up throwing punches after one of them supposedly walked in on Chaka and the other in a moment that was too close for bandmates. The incident never hit the papers. Hotel security, label reps, and management allegedly smothered it before dawn. But the real shift came when Prince entered the frame. It's 1,978 late-night sessions at Paisley Park. Prince pads around the studio barefoot, restless, while Chaka steps to the mic. An engineer who later spoke off the record said their chemistry felt like electricity in the walls. It didn't read as romance, it read as danger. Gasoline stacked next to an open flame. Chaka always denied that anything romantic happened between them. Still, insiders insist Prince wrote certain lyrics directly to her lines they believed were too intimate, too specific, to be just artistic inspiration. Whether that's truth or projection remains one of the era's most persistent questions. And then came Rick James. If Prince was a controlled fire, Rick was an explosion with no off switch. Los Angeles, 1979, a multi-artist afterparty in the Hollywood Hills. According to multiple witnesses, Chaka and Rick slipped away from the crowd and disappeared into a bathroom for nearly an hour. One backup singer later claimed they emerged laughing like two kids who'd just gotten away with something they should never have done. Neither Chaka nor Rick ever confirmed that night. But Rick James's own writings, people say, hint at a funk queen who could match him line for line and hit for hit when it came to excess. Outside of the men, her clashes with other women in the industry were just as fierce. Her rumored feud with Mary J. Blige was said to have started in the late 1992 during rehearsals for a benefit show. Two powerful voices, one rehearsal room, too much ego and history. A producer described it as oil and gasoline sharing the same spark. According to people who were there, Chaka allegedly made a cutting remark about Mary copying her sound. Mary, never one to back down, reportedly fired back just as hard. What could have been a simple disagreement nearly turned into a full-blown shouting match before staff intervened, leaving a chill that never fully thawed. With Whitney Houston, the tension was different, colder, quieter. During a 1991 recording session for a charity single, insiders said Whitney refused to stand next to Chaka for group photos, allegedly calling her too unpredictable. In response, Chaka was rumored to have muttered that Whitney was a pretty voice with no funk, a line that traveled around studios for years as a whispered quote. Floating above all of this was her most dangerous enemy, addiction. Between 1974 and 1979, Chaka's drug use reportedly deepened to the point where her romantic life became almost unrecognizable, a revolving door with no lock and no pattern. Friends from that era said she could fall madly in love by sunset and end it without a word by sunrise. In a later interview, Chaka herself admitted that during her worst years she destroyed good men, good women, and solid friendships because she couldn't control her highs or her rage. She confessed that she sabotaged everything because she didn't like herself enough to believe she deserved to keep anything stable. That is the brutal contrast of Chaka Khan's story, a voice many people believe was touched by something divine, strapped to a life almost wrecked by everything earthly that came with fame. It starts in a hallway that smells like old smoke and cheap carpet cleaner. The year is 1976. A hotel clerk at the Statler Hilton glances up from the front desk and freezes. He would later tell a reporter that he saw a woman running, like every step might be her last chance. He didn't realize it was Tina Turner until she hit the lobby lights and her face came into focus. She is barefoot, she is bruised, she is shaking, and for the first time in 16 years, she is free. But freedom came with a hunger nobody prepared her for. After she walked away from Ike, the industry quietly predicted she would fade, maybe take a modest solo gig, or vanish into retirement. Instead, she entered what insiders now call the unfilmed years, a chapter so chaotic, smoky, and rumor-soaked that it exists mostly in other people's memories. These were the nights when Tina drifted through cities like a restless ghost, desperate to feel alive again. Musicians, roadies, rock stars, any man who crossed her path could find himself folded into a story cameras never caught. One of the earliest tales dates back to 1977 at the Oakland Coliseum. A sound technician claimed he cut through a backstage hallway and caught a glimpse he never forgot. Tina pressed up against a wall with a young R&B drummer. They weren't fighting. They were breathing each other in, faces inches apart, locked in a moment so intimate the tech quietly closed the door and walked away. That same night, she hit the stage and delivered a flawless performance, as if nothing behind the curtain had ever happened. By 1978, the tabloids could smell a new storyline. Photographers began tailing her from hotel to venue, trying to turn whispers into evidence. One shooter reportedly snapped a photo of her slipping out of a Holiday Inn in Chicago at sunrise, walking beside a well-known rock guitarist. He carried her shoes. She wore his jacket. According to people who worked at the label, that picture never saw the light of day. The company allegedly bought the image for $2,000 and buried it in a drawer, but the witnesses didn't forget what they saw. Then came Ike's nuclear accusation. During an interview in Memphis, a journalist asked him why he believed Tina finally left. Ike leaned back, narrowed his eyes, and shot back a venomous answer, claiming she had been involved with 3 men in his own band. He named no names, showed no proof, just pure spite poured into a single sentence. In the late 72nds, though, that kind of allegation was all a headline needed to ignite. The most infamous rumor from this era surfaced after a taping of The Midnight Special in 1979. Crew members recalled Tina leaving the studio alongside a charismatic black keyboardist, a man already known in industry circles for seducing his way through half the scene. They were seen ducking into a silver Cadillac parked just out of sight lines. A janitor sweeping nearby later claimed he heard muffled laughter, sharp arguing, and what sounded like a kiss hitting the glass of a car window. Tina denied any affair. The keyboardist denied it too. But as one crew member said years later, cameras don't lie, they just weren't pointed in that direction that night. Those years became the period when, according to friends, Tina chased noise because silence sounded too much like Ike. She took the late-night parties, the whirlwind flings, the moments with men who made her feel powerful for a few hours at a time. She kissed strangers like she was trying to overwrite every bruise, every slap, every insult with a new memory that belonged to her alone. By 1983, she had rebuilt herself as a global force, a rock and soul titan reborn. But the 7 years between her escape and that rebirth, the rebound years, the chaotic years, the whispered years, remain a chapter the public still only knows in broken fragments and unconfirmed stories. Tina Turner didn't just outlive Ike Turner. According to those who watched that era from the wings, she also had to learn how to survive the version of herself that rose from the wreckage. If you were standing backstage at the Atlanta Civic Center in 1978, you would have heard her before you ever saw her. A laugh deep, reckless, and so unapologetically filthy that grown men supposedly stared down at their shoes. That was Millie Jackson coming down the corridor, moving with a swagger that said she feared nothing and wanted everything. The woman later dubbed the Queen of Explicit R&B didn't just walk into rooms, she detonated them. That same night, a local news crew accidentally recorded what insiders still call the most infamous pre-show moment of her career. Their camera lens stayed on a closed curtain, but the microphone, left running near a dressing room door, picked up something else entirely. According to people who later heard the tape, Millie was pressing a crew member up against the wall. He wasn't struggling, he was surrendering. The clatter of his clipboard hitting the floor was reportedly so clear that the audio engineers at the station archived it as evidence of a moment they could never air. Seconds later, Millie stepped out, lipstick sharp, eyes blazing, not a hair out of place. Whispers followed everywhere she toured. People said she was seeing multiple men at once, not because she went out of her way to deny it, but because she never seemed interested in hiding anything. During the recording of one of her most provocative albums, Feeling, insiders claimed Millie rotated between 3 lovers with the same calm efficiency she brought to a studio session. One was a funk bassist with a reputation for trouble. Another was a soul singer whose marriage was already hanging by a thread. The third was a married producer who, according to staffers, often left the studio with his shirt buttoned, crooked, and his hair looking like he'd been dragged through a storm. When someone allegedly challenged her about it, Millie is rumored to have replied, "I don't cheat, I just stay busy." The Real Thing tour turned everything up another notch. On stage in Atlanta, in front of a packed crowd, she pulled a man from the audience, wrapped a leg around his waist, and leaned in so close he froze like he'd been zapped. Whatever she whispered into his ear stayed between them, but witnesses said his face turned the color of a warning light. Backstage, the backlash came fast. A female journalist confronted her, furious, accusing her of dragging black women through the mud. Millie took a slow drag from her cigarette, flicked ash like a period at the end of a sentence, and reportedly replied with ice-cold calm, "Sweetheart, I'm not degrading anyone, I'm educating them." But the darkest stories didn't come from the press. They came from the industry's own shadows. One night in Memphis, a producer's wife arrived at the studio unannounced. She walked into the mixing room and found it empty. The lights turned low, monitors still glowing. From a locked vocal booth, she heard Millie's laughter sharp, unmistakable. Minutes later, the door opened. The producer stepped out first, smoothing his hair. Millie followed, brushing glitter off her dress like dust. The wife said nothing in public. She didn't have to. The rumor did the talking for her. There were also quiet stories about 2 married R&B legends who were terrified she might say their names out loud. One allegedly sent her flowers regularly, as if bribing silence. The other sent messages through mutual friends. According to those who watched from the sidelines, neither of them slept comfortably for months. Millie Jackson didn't dodge scandal, she managed it. She didn't run from rumors, she fed them just enough to keep control. And everyone in the business understood one rule. If you crossed Millie, you might end up immortalized in one of her lyrics, tangled in her sheets, or splashed across a tabloid cover, wondering how a single night with her turned into a story you could never quite escape. Before Mary J. Blige was crowned the Queen of Hip-Hop Soul, before the Grammys, the arena tours, and the legend status, she was a girl from Yonkers carrying wounds nobody could see from the outside. And when fame finally slammed into her life, it didn't arrive alone. It brought temptation, chaos, and a trail of relationships so volatile that insiders still lower their voices when they talk about them in studio hallways. The story opens in 1991, inside a dim recording booth at Uptown Records. A 20-year-old Mary leans into the microphone, eyes shut, fists clenched at her sides, pouring every scar into the early takes of What's the 411? The engineers outside barely move. One of them would later say she didn't sing Heartbreak, she sounded like she was trying to survive it in real time. With every note that climbed the charts, another rumor climbed with it. The first real wave of gossip hit during the making of her second album in 1994. Producers claimed Mary often showed up late to sessions, a different man waiting outside the studio doors each night like a rotating cast no one dared list by name. Some were dancers. Some were hungry young rappers looking for a way into her orbit. And one, according to whispers, was a married R&B singer who told his label he was working late every time he visited the building. There were stories about arguments exploding in parking lots, men pacing near side entrances, and Mary's team forming a human shield whenever tension threatened to spill into paparazzi lenses. And then came Casey from Jodeci. That wasn't just a relationship, people inside the game describe it as a storm system. Everyone who survived the mid-90 seconds music scene has a Casey and Mary story. Screaming matches in hotel hallways, jealousy that didn't care who was listening, love that sounded like war. A backup singer from a 1995 New York show recalled one night backstage when KC grabbed Mary by the arm and accused her of being too close to a producer she'd been photographed hugging. Mary screamed back so loud that security rushed in, hands already up, ready to break it apart. Hours later, the same witnesses saw them in a dark corner of a Harlem nightclub, pressed together in a booth, kissing like the fight never happened. That was the rhythm of those years, destruction at 3 p.m., devotion by midnight. This was the era when Mary's addictions were said to be spiraling and her love life spun right alongside them. Friends from that time described a woman who lived fast, loved even faster, and forgave people long after she should have walked away. They claimed she would cry alone in a studio bathroom at 3 a.m., splash water on her face, then step back to the mic and deliver a vocal that sounded like she'd torn it straight from an open wound. One persistent rumor from 1997 said Mary briefly became involved with a well-known East Coast rapper, a man infamous for his raw lyrics and dangerous entourage. According to an insider, they met during a late-night session at Daddy's house. He cracked jokes. She smiled for the first time in hours. Within weeks, tabloids were printing stories that they were inseparable. Both denied it immediately. But crew members still insist they watched the two slip into a black SUV after the Soul Train Awards and not reappear until the sky had started to lighten. Her marriage to Kendu Isaacs years later didn't calm the waters. It became the eye of a new storm. By 2016, divorce documents revealed claims that Mary had spent significant amounts of money on male companions, gifts, flights, hotel rooms, nights that never made it onto social media. Some filings hinted at emotional entanglements with trainers, musicians, even a wardrobe assistant who traveled with her. A former stylist summed it up in one brutal sentence. Mary didn't cheat for adrenaline. She strayed when she felt abandoned. And according to those closest to her, loneliness followed her from Yonkers to the top of the charts like a shadow she could never quite outrun. The truth about Mary J. Blige, as told by those who watched her rise, is simple and devastating. She sang heartbreak because she lived inside it. She loved like the ground could disappear beneath her feet at any moment. And the men who passed through her life, producers, singers, rappers, managers, became chapters of a story the world still hasn't heard in full, only in echoes between the lines of her songs. Before the world called her a legend, Diana Ross learned one lesson inside Motown that would shape everything that followed. Power didn't come from talent alone. It came from who was willing to fall at your feet and who you were willing to step over. The Real opens in Detroit, February 1964, inside Motown's cramped headquarters on West Grand Boulevard. A bitter wind rattles the thin windows while the Supremes record background vocals for a song they aren't even formally scheduled to sing on. The air is stale with cigarette smoke and ambition. In the center of Studio A stands Diana Ross, eyes locked not on the microphone but on Berry Gordy, watching from behind the glass. According to an assistant engineer who claimed to be there that night, you could feel it in the room. She wasn't just singing for the track, she was singing for him. What unfolded between 1964 and 1970 became one of Motown's most whispered stories. An alleged triangle between Diana, Motown founder Berry Gordy, and Mary Wilson, her bandmate, her shadow, and sometimes, according to insiders, her casualty. One of the earliest flashpoints allegedly came on the 16th of July, 1965, during rehearsals for The Ed Sullivan Show. Mary Wilson arrived early, expecting the usual chaos of band members and staff. Instead, she walked into Studio B and found Berry and Diana alone, sitting close together on a piano bench. Too close for comfort. Witnesses later said they jumped up, almost in unison. Diana tugged at her dress, smoothing the fabric like she could iron out what Mary had just seen. Berry adjusted his tie, suddenly formal in a room that had been intimate seconds before. Mary didn't confront them then, but the next day she reportedly told a backup singer, "I know what I saw." From that moment, nothing in the group felt the same. Producers started insisting Diana sing lead on more and more tracks, even on songs people said were originally written with Mary's voice in mind. Session by session, performance by performance, Motown's promotional machine subtly shifted. Diana moved to the center of every frame. Mary slipped toward the edges. Interviews, album covers, press photos, they all told the same new story. Diana was the star. Mary was the echo. Insiders claim Diana didn't just rise, she climbed with precision. A Motown choreographer recalled a night in August 1966 after a show in New Jersey. As the crowd emptied out, Diana reportedly left the venue with a famous Motown songwriter whose wife also worked at the label. He returned alone about 3 hours later, shirt wrinkled, hair tousled like he'd been dragged through a long argument or something more dangerous. According to a studio tech, Diana walked back in about 10 minutes after that, hair freshly brushed, expression unreadable. Nothing was said. No questions were asked. But inside Motown, silence was its own kind of confirmation. By 1967, the rumors had evolved into something sharper. People weren't just whispering that Diana was Berry's favorite. Some claimed she was untouchable. A former producer told a journalist years later that if Diana wanted a track remixed, it got remixed. If she didn't want to share a spotlight, that spotlight narrowed immediately. If she wanted someone gone, it was said that their time at Motown ended quietly, sometimes overnight. She didn't beg, he recalled. She seduced. She persuaded. She walked into a room like she already owned the outcome. The tension finally boiled over on the 14th of January 1969 during a closed-door meeting at Motown headquarters. Mary Wilson, pushed aside one time too many, confronted Diana about being erased from the forefront of the group she helped build. An intern sitting outside the office claimed he heard Mary's voice rising through the door, shaking with anger. "You don't get to use men like stepping stones," she reportedly shouted. Diana's reply, according to that same intern, was the opposite of emotional. Calm, precise. "Then step out of my way." Mary left that meeting in tears. Diana left with the groundwork laid for a solo development deal. In the official history, it was just business. Off the record, people described it as a turning point where friendship, loyalty, and ambition collided, and ambition walked out holding the contract. The final blow came in 1970 when Diana announced she was leaving the Supremes. The public heard a polished story about growth, solo potential, and creative direction. Inside Motown, staffers whispered that Berry Gordy had decided months earlier, and once Diana's influence locked that decision in, nothing and no one could reverse it. After she walked away from the group, several Motown producers reportedly shared a chilling observation in private conversations. Diana Ross, they said, had a talent that went beyond her voice. She could make any man believe he had chosen her when, in reality, she had chosen him first. Diana Ross didn't just survive Motown. She bent it, reshaped it, and walked out wrapped in a myth the label still pretends not to hear rumors about. Behind the glitter and the #1 records lies a quieter question: how much of that ascent was about destiny, and how much was about knowing exactly which hearts and which loyalties she could afford to break along the way? They called her the Queen of Soul. But between 1965 and 1975, there was another title whispered behind studio doors, in green rooms, and between cigarette drags after shows, the woman who loved in the dark. Because when the lights went out, Aretha Franklin stepped into a private world that no official biography has ever fully pinned down. Detroit, March 1965. Snow falls like dust over the city as Aretha steps out of a car outside the 20 Grand Club. She's only 23, already rising, wrapped in a white fur coat that catches every bit of neon light from the sign above. Men at the entrance stop talking mid-sentence to watch her walk past. Years later, a saxophonist who played that night would say, "Aretha didn't just walk into a room, she changed the temperature." And with that heat came rumors, fast, loud, and relentless. Her first major scandal, according to those who tracked every move of that early tour schedule, erupted in 1967 during a southern run of shows. After a performance in Jackson, Mississippi, Aretha vanished from sight for nearly 2 hours. Ted White, her husband and manager, stormed through the hotel hallways, shouting her name, knocking on doors. A maid later confessed she had quietly pointed him toward room 314. What happened next became part of backstage folklore. Ted reportedly opened the door to find Aretha inside, laughing with a well-known soul guitarist. The doorframe was cracked by the time it was over. The hotel, trying to keep things quiet, allegedly sent a private bill for $128 in damages paid, but never discussed. When her mother died in 1968, something inside her shifted. Her sisters would later say that Aretha entered a darker romantic period, drifting between men the way she drifted between cities on tour. Insiders claimed she began traveling with companions whose names never appeared on official paperwork. They weren't band, they weren't staff, they were just with her. One sound engineer in Cleveland, November 1969, recounted walking past her dressing room before a show and hearing 2 male voices inside with hers. When Aretha opened the door, her hair looked slightly tousled, her expression cool. "Baby, you're early," she supposedly said, turning the intrusion into a joke that ended the conversation before it started. Then came the rumor that refused to die. In 1971, a gospel singer who visited her backstage at the Auditorium Theater in Chicago claimed he had seen a handwritten list taped to the inside of her mirror. According to him, it was a coded catalog of initials, male favorites, neatly organized by city. He repeated the story for years. No one ever proved that list existed, no photograph surfaced. But the rumor moved through the industry like gasoline, searching for a match. Her life tangled with other soul legends as well. In October 1972, backstage at a Soul Train taping, a production assistant reported seeing Aretha pressed against a wall, locked in a kiss with a married R&B icon just outside the camera's framing. The assistant later said she was warned she could lose her job if she mentioned it again. She didn't speak on the record, but she spoke anyway, quietly, off the books. By 1974, those whispers collided head-on with her already turbulent personal life. She missed 2 shows in Atlanta, a rarity for someone who treated the stage like a sanctuary. When a bandmate confronted her about it, Aretha reportedly snapped, "Men don't heal me, they distract me." It was, according to those who heard about it, the closest she ever came to acknowledging the chaos of a decade spent loving in the shadows. Finally, in 1975, a friend of her father's summed up her secret life in one chilling line. He said Aretha saved her real honesty for the microphone, and everything else, the hurt, the desire, the complicated attachments, she lived behind curtains. Aretha Franklin gave the world gospel, soul, and brutal emotional truth every time she opened her mouth to sing. But in love, she walked where the spotlight could never fully reach. She loved in the dark, and no amount of stage light ever truly found its way in. Every great love story has two sides. But whatever existed between Tina Marie and Rick James didn't feel like a love story to the people who watched it unfold. It felt like a collision. What happened between 1979 and 1984 wasn't romance. It was a wildfire that left scorch marks across Motown that insiders still talk about in lowered voices. The first frame is Motown headquarters, Los Angeles, August 1979. Sunlight hits the marble steps as 3-year-old Tina Marie walks through the glass doors for a meeting that would change everything. She isn't a superstar yet, but one receptionist later claimed you could feel trouble walking in with her, some strange mix of innocence and danger wrapped in one small body. Waiting upstairs is Rick James, high, brilliant, magnetic, a storm in sunglasses. People who were there say he was intrigued before she even opened her mouth to sing. Their first real chemistry test happens weeks later at Record Plant Studios, September 1979. Engineers remember Rick closing the booth door, dimming the lights, and moving in close as Tina stepped to the mic. One engineer later described it like this: "It didn't sound like a normal session. It sounded like foreplay recorded on tape." Whether that was exaggeration or truth, no one can say for sure. What is clear is that a line was crossed that night, and the industry has been speculating about it ever since. As months passed, the rumors multiplied. Members of Rick's Stone City Band claimed that during late-night sessions in 1980, Tina and Rick would vanish into a locked booth for hours while musicians sat outside trading looks and watching the clock. When the door finally opened, people said Tina's lipstick looked blurred and Rick's shirt hung open, buttons mismatched or undone. No one asked questions. At Motown, not asking was part of the job. The darkest story from that era is one few people are willing to repeat on record. In 1981, a sound engineer delivering coffee to Studio B reportedly walked in at the wrong moment and saw Tina, Rick, and a female backup singer tangled together on a couch. He claims he backed out before anyone noticed and that 10 minutes later, someone locked the door from the inside. The backup singer quit by the end of the week, refusing to discuss why. Their connection, whatever label you put on it, ran on cocaine, jealousy, obsession, and a kind of passion that never settled. And cocaine, as more than one bandmate later pointed out, always wins in the end. In 1982, Tina was photographed leaving a Hollywood Hills party with what appeared to be white residue on her wrist. She told people it was makeup. Insiders quietly insisted the real story was different. Rick, already spiraling, dragged her into deeper water. A guitarist from Stone City has claimed that Rick once smashed a lamp outside Studio A because he was convinced Tina had spent the night with a saxophonist. Whether any affair actually happened stopped mattering. What mattered was that Rick believed it. His jealousy didn't need proof, it only needed a rumor. Neighbors from Venice Beach described hearing shouting from Tina's apartment in February 1983, raised voices, something heavy crashing, then a long stretch of silence. An hour later, those same neighbors said they saw Tina and Rick walking out together, laughing as if the walls hadn't just absorbed an argument that might have ended most relationships. The breaking point arrived during a Stone City Band rehearsal in Detroit, June 1984. They were running through a song when Tina suddenly collapsed mid-phrase. Witnesses recall the room freezing. When she opened her eyes, she looked at a bandmate and whispered words that would echo long after the music stopped. "I can't survive him." And by then, everyone understood she wasn't talking about chart positions or label politics. Not long after, their paths began to pull apart. Official statements stayed vague, creative differences, business shifts, new directions. But those who saw the inside of that bond believed something more fragile had finally snapped. Their love, if that's what it could be called, had been legendary for its intensity and just as legendary for its damage. Tina Marie didn't simply date Rick James. According to the people who watched the rise and fall up close, she collided with him. And the impact the songs, the rumors, the addictions, the nights no one will fully describe on camera still lingers in every half-told story. Motown veterans refuse to finish. Janet Jackson's soft-spoken image has always been a kind of armor. The real story lived underneath it, in locked hotel rooms, sealed court papers, and rumors the industry learned to step around carefully. Her first scandal began long before the world saw her as a global icon. At barely 18, she slipped out from under the Jackson family's constant surveillance and married James DeBarge in a late-night ceremony attended by only a handful of witnesses. Church workers later recalled how her hand shook as she signed her name, while James kept glancing toward the door like he expected it to fly open and the entire Jackson clan to storm in and drag them away. The marriage cracked almost as soon as it began. There were nights, people said, when James disappeared without explanation. Nights when Janet sat alone, waiting, unsure whether he would come back at all. When she finally walked away and the annulment became official, the paperwork closed one chapter but left a stain that gossip writers never stopped revisiting. As Control and Rhythm Nation redefined who Janet Jackson was in the public eye, the press quietly began building an alternate version of her, a woman they claimed was cycling through dancers, producers, and assistants behind the scenes. Tabloid stories painted a picture of tour dancers sneaking down hotel hallways after midnight, slipping into her room through side entrances. Other outlets suggested she carried on a secret romance with a man whose name they described in hints but never printed. One source described Janet as someone who became emotionally attached too quickly, implying that what looked like professional camaraderie on the surface hid something far more complicated behind closed doors. None of it was ever confirmed. That didn't matter. The rumors didn't need proof. They just needed repetition. Then came the story that refused to die, the alleged secret pregnancy. For years, whispers claimed Janet had quietly given birth and that a relative was raising the child as their own. The tabloids reported it like it was settled fact. Fans argued about clues and timelines like a true crime case. Talk show hosts pushed her for answers she refused to give. A family friend later said that Janet learned to survive as a Jackson by going silent and letting lies burn themselves out. But these lies never fully burned out. They hovered over her like smoke, always drifting back whenever her name hit the headlines. The chaos of the Velvet Rope era only intensified the chatter. Her dancers described her as more emotionally open, more vulnerable, more connected to the people around her. That vulnerability was quickly twisted into insinuations. Reporters claimed she was romantically involved with more than one person on her own tour. A bodyguard got dragged into the stories too, with one magazine suggesting he spent too much time alone with her after shows. No evidence surfaced. Still, the whispers became part of her legend. Then came the blast that shook her entire career. The Super Bowl. In a few seconds of live television, the country turned on her. As the outrage surged, the media didn't just dissect that one moment, they used it as a reason to exhume everything. Old accusations were dragged out again like exhibits in a trial. The secret husband, the alleged hidden child, the dancers, the bodyguard. Commentators accused her of decades of deception, saying she had spent her whole life hiding in plain sight. TV panels replayed the same tabloid stories as if they were newly uncovered evidence instead of recycled speculation. People who knew her say Janet pulled back completely during that time, not just because of what the world thought it saw on stage, but because of how quickly that moment was used as permission to tear apart every private piece of her life. One producer who worked closely with her said, "The Super Bowl didn't break Janet. What broke her was everything they tried to glue onto it." Her music endured. Her influence on pop and R&B remained. And her secrets, whatever they truly were, stayed exactly where she wanted them. Behind a door only she holds the key to, Patti LaBelle's life on stage always looked like pure celebration, high notes, bright gowns, and joy that seemed to spill past the footlights. But the stories behind her rise were far more tangled than any fan in the front row ever knew. During the height of LaBelle's fame, Patti carried a reputation among musicians for a passion that moved faster than the tour schedule itself. Those who worked with her in that era described a woman who lived intensely, who formed connections in an instant, and who left emotional wreckage behind without ever meaning to. One of the first visible cracks appeared during a rehearsal at the Uptown Theater in Philadelphia. In the middle of what should have been a routine run-through, a heated argument erupted between Patti and Sarah Dash. The shouting spilled into the hallway, loud enough that crew members stopped what they were doing and just listened. People who claimed to be there said the tension could be traced back to one thing: a popular male soul singer who had grown close to both women. None of the three ever laid out the story publicly. There were no press conferences, no interviews spelling it out. But those who watched the fallout said the energy inside the group shifted overnight from sisterhood to something colder, more fragile. As LaBelle hit city after city, Patti's reputation as someone who formed brief, powerful, and complicated attachments kept growing. A guitarist who toured with them for several legs said Patti had a way of looking you in the eye once and making you forget whoever might be waiting for you back home. In cities like Detroit, Chicago, and San Francisco, backstage whispers followed her like an echo, stories of late-night dinners turning into early-morning exits, of musicians vanishing into elevators with her after-shows, of tour staff suddenly finding very interesting reasons to look the other way. One incident in New Orleans became part of unofficial LaBelle folklore. After a massive show in the French Quarter, hotel workers noticed Patti arriving at a side entrance with a well-known R&B singer whose marriage was already rumored to be in trouble. She registered under an alias. He reportedly used a service elevator to avoid being seen. Patti slipped out just before sunrise, heading straight to rehearsal, carrying herself with the calm of someone who had long since learned how to move between worlds without leaving footprints. Then there was the rumor that refused to fade: the supposed relationship between Patti and another legendary female singer. Fans traded theories. Comment sections and forums dissected glances, interviews, and duets like evidence. Journalists tried to touch the topic gently, wrapping questions in compliments